Hi everybody, Tony here on Dracaris, a Leopard 50 sailing catamaran. Recently I decided to check the valve clearances on my Northern Lights generator engine. And the service manual says that, kind of gives some conflicting information. It says that on the service schedule chart, it says that check valve clearance every 100 hours. And that just didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me, considering that an oil change interval is 200 hours and that you would check the valve clearances at every oil change, and halfway between each oil change just didn't add up to me. If you actually go to the valve clearances section in the service manual, it says adjust valve clearances at 1,000 hours, or after 1,000 hours. So, well, like everything else with this manual, I take it with a healthy dose of skepticism and a grain of salt. For example, here on the component diagram, it shows that, well, this item here is clearly the oil filter, but it's labeled as item 14, and 14 is identified as the fuel filter. It's definitely not the fuel filter, it's the oil filter. So anyway, my generator has about 550 hours on it, and I decided, you know, it's an easy task to do. If you're able to change your own engine oil, then I would say that you have the mechanical aptitude to check your own valve clearances and make the adjustments if necessary. So I did that recently and made a video. Hopefully it helps people go through the process if you've never done it yourself. So valve clearances, if you don't know, are important in engine maintenance. Well, I guess just very generally, every cylinder has valves that open and close at different times in the four-stroke cycle. You have intake valves, which let fresh air in, and your exhaust valves, which obviously lets the byproducts of combustion, the exhaust, out of the cylinder. On my generator, there's a single intake valve and a single exhaust valve on each cylinder. Depending on the engine, there can be 2 valves on each side. There can be 3 valve engines where you have either 2 intake and a single exhaust, or vice versa. But there's 1 of each on mine, makes it very simple. And there's the shape of those valves, there's a mechanism called the rocker arm that as the crankshaft turns, the rocker arm depresses the valve stem and opens that valve into the cylinder. And the clearance between that rocker arm, I'm doing things with my fingers, but you can Google some images if I don't find any to put up. If the clearance between the valve stem and the rocker arm is too big, then the valve's not going to open as much as it should. And well, you can have other issues there. The impact of that rocker arm hitting the valve stem can deform it, and you hear this in a form of a ticking. If the valve clearances are too tight, in other words, there's not just a tiny bit of a gap there, this can actually prevent the valve from closing entirely within the cylinder. So in that case, you're going to get create a couple of issues. You're going to lose compression because the cylinder is not sealed, and then to the degree that that valve is not seated against the valve seat during the combustion process, you're going to get almost a blowtorch effect through that gap, and it can actually score. What's the word I'm looking for? Well, it's like a blowtorch, and it's going to etch that the valve seat, which would be a permanent damage type of a thing. You'd have to have that remachined or replaced. So it's a yeah, it's a very simple process, really, and I hope this video helps. All right, so the first thing we got to do is remove the, what is this, the cam cover?
Yeah.
It's a great way to start, isn't it?
It's cold though.
on this. It's gonna come out like that. It can just sit there. And then this should lift straight up. There we go. So there's the gasket, which looks good. There's no reason that should get messed up if you take it off gently, right? I think a key point is you never want to get a screwdriver in this joint and start prying to lift this off, because you know this is just cast aluminum.
Yeah, pretty light.
Yeah, very light. You bend that. Okay, there we go. There's our valves. All right, so then we just have to get the belt cover off, which is all right. Okay, now that I've got the rocker arm cover off and the belt cover off, we've got to rotate the engine by hand, rotate the crank by hand to get the cylinder number 1, which is this one, towards the pulley end of the engine. Cylinder number 1 into top dead center position, meaning that it's at the top of its compression stroke. Both the intake and the exhaust valves will be fully closed at that point. The other valves will be in different stages. We'll cover that in a second. So ideally here, you would have the right size socket to fit that nut, which I do not. So I'm using vice grips. What we're doing here is, switch this into macro mode. Maybe I can get a better shot. There's a mark on the engine itself. Hopefully that's visible behind the belt, where there's a little scale and it says top. And what we need to do is align the casting of the pulley. There's a okay, I can actually get a video on it. Let me rotate the engine here. See if I can. Yeah, right there. So that little notch needs to be lined up with that, hold the straight, top mark. Hard to do with one hand on the camera and the other on this here. So if I were to line this up here, which I just did, I mean, it's not precise because it's really not correct. I look at the rocker arms and I can tell that they're in different positions. So this one's slightly depressed, this one is up, which means that the engine has to be rotated 360 degrees because this is not on the compression stroke. So you got to look at that. So when you line it up, check to make sure that your rocker arms are both up, meaning the valves are both closed. So I'm gonna try to set the camera down here and rotate the engine by hand 360 degrees, and we'll come back to that in a second. All right. Rotate this through. Until that mark is in the right spot. Right. When the engine's at top dead center, zoom out a touch here, you'll see that both of these rocker arms are up, which means these valves are completely closed because these rocker arms push down on the valve stem and open up the valve into the cylinder. So what we're wanting to measure here, or adjust, is the gap. Here we go, this is a better view. We're wanting to measure the gap between the top of the valve stem and the rocker arm. And I'm using a set of feeler gauges here that come in different dimensions. And from the manual, the gap is supposed to be 8 thousandths. So it was upside down, but I'm using the 8 thousandths gauge, which I know won't fit. And the reason that I know that I won't fit is because this is the second time that I've done this in the last 20 minutes, because I went through this entire process and read the manual wrong and set this gap to 2 thousandths, which is really frustrating. But that's fine. It allows me to get a little bit better video than I did the first time, I think, of this process. So the way that these get adjusted is they have a set screw and a lock nut on the opposite side. So we're going to loosen the lock nut, turn the set screw tiny amounts, and that is going to change the clearance between the valve stem and the rocker arm here. And that's a loud airplane. Let me set the camera up to start this process. All right, so you want to loosen up the lock nut. Ideally, you would use an open-ended box wrench. I can't find my number 10 millimeter open-ended box wrench, so unfortunately I have to deal with this ratchet device. So loosen up your lock nuts. I'll just do all of them at once. In the manual, it's going to show you when you're at top dead center on cylinder number 1, it's going to tell you which cylinders or which valves are in the correct position, which means fully closed position. So the manual tells me that the intake valve of cylinder number 1, the exhaust valve of cylinder number 1, and the exhaust valve of cylinder number 2 are all closed when the engine is in this position, top dead center of cylinder number 1. So I've loosened up those 3. And now I will take the proper feeler gauge, which is 8 thousandths, not 2 thousandths like I used just a little bit ago, and insert it between the valve stem. Let's see if I keep my hands out of the way here. Between the valve stem and the rocker arm, which I know it doesn't fit because I set it too tight earlier. So this is a very sensitive adjustment on the set screw, and what you're looking for is just a light resistance on this feeler gauge going in. So you shouldn't have to shove it in, but it shouldn't just go in without any resistance whatsoever. So it's something I can't really show on camera. You just have to feel it. This is the right feel. It doesn't try to bend that gauge. It just goes in with a touch of resistance. I'm going to back that out just a tiny bit. There we go. So it's got a good feel. It's a light pinch on that feeler gauge. And once you have it set correctly, then this is the challenging part. You need to get onto your lock nut here. Again, better with the right tool. Hold the set screw perfectly in place. I already moved it a touch, unfortunately. And then, I wish this were not a ratchet. And then tighten down your set screw, or set nut, lock nut. Now, the nature of that process right there always seems to change your gap. So I always go back in and feel it, and that is a good fit. It goes in, but not effortlessly, but with not too much effort. So the intake valve on cylinder 1 is done. Intake valve on cylinder 2 is obviously going to be too tight because I made it too tight. So I'm going to back it out, get my gauge in, set that down. And then one of the ways I do this is, hope my hands aren't in the way, is to put the gauge in and tighten it down until you start to feel it pinch. Right about there, I can feel the drag on it. And when it feels just enough, and kind of go back in and from the outside and just insert it and see if you get a little resistance. And I do. Not a lot, but some. And go through the same process here of trying to get that lock nut set without moving the set screw whatsoever. That ratchet doesn't even, there we go. These were really tight from the factory. I'm doing them reasonably tight. And then go back and check it and make sure nothing moved in the process, because oftentimes it does, but that did not. That's got a good, just a light drag on that 8/1000ths feeler gauge. So again, the manual told me intake on one, exhaust on one. Why did that move? Okay, it's gonna have a little bit of play when it's, yeah, there we go. And then exhaust on two. So tighten this down until I get some drag. There we go. It goes in, but you can see it kind of grabbing it just a little bit. That feels right. And then hold it. I moved it. Let's see if I can put it back where it was. See if I get lucky. Let's find out. That's a little, you know what? It's on the tight side of perfect. So it goes, that might be too tight. So the danger is if you don't have enough clearance between the rocker arm and the valve stem, when the valve is supposed to be closed, it's going to be being held open just a tiny amount, and you're going to lose compression on your cylinders. The opposite is if your valve clearance is too loose, then the valve's not going to open as much as it should, and you're not going to get a either a proper exhaust process or what am I doing here? I need to loosen this. There we go. Loosen that up. Back it off a tiny bit. That feels just right. I was saying something about the clearances. Oh yeah, if the clearance is too loose, then you're not going to open your valves completely, which isn't good, and you'll get knocking. You hear it tick, 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 tick. That's the this rocker arm. Actually, you'll hear it hitting the top of the valve stem. So after I've tightened that, let's double check it. Yep, that feels good. That feels good. That feels good. And now we have to rotate the engine 360 degrees to get these three valves, or valves closed, which means the rockers will be in the full up position. So that'll be at one full rotation of the engine from where it is currently. So we have to go back to the front of the engine here, turn it 360 degrees. You're pushing it through a compression stroke, so it's not easy. Again, with the right tool, it would be easier than what I'm using here. Lining up the mark on the pulley, or the piece that's actually cast into the pulley, with the top dead center gauge where it says top that I showed you earlier. And I'm moving it ever so slightly. I think that's it right there. That should be just this side of perfect. Let me look. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay. So hopefully as I was doing that, you were able to see these moving. So yeah, now I can see this valve is open, it's pushed down. This valve is closed because there's nothing pushing on it. And then these three are in the proper position to be adjusted. So since I already know they're tight because I screwed it up earlier, I'm going to loosen up the nut. There we go. No, this one. And that's a little bit of paint. Get that out of there. And then take my gauge. Hopefully my hand is not in these shots here. And I can't get, of course, the proper gauge in because I set the valve clearances too tight. I'm going to loop back this off until it goes in. Tighten it. You can see how little it took. I really wish these screws were a finer thread because then it would be a little bit easier. So that is going in with just a little bit of friction. I can feel it go in. Really hard to describe on camera, but when you do it, if it's just going in and you don't feel the moment that it actually inserts, that's too loose. If you're pushing on this and it buckles your gauge, you're too tight. But this is perfect. It's got a nice feel going in there. So then get this on here, hold it in position, tighten her up. My ratchet's rusted. Crank that down a little. Go back in and test it to make sure it didn't move while you're tightening the lock nut, because it does. No, that feels great. All right. Switch hands here because the camera's in the way. Is this still in frame, I wonder? No, it's not. Let's move it. How about that? Okay, so now I'm coming in. Get my gauge in, tighten it down until I start to feel a little bit of drag. That feels good. Insert it, I can feel it going in just with enough drag. That felt good. Get my lock nut set. Go back in and test to make sure it didn't move. Nope, I'm getting lucky with those. And then move on to this one, which of course is too, well, I can shove it in there, but yeah, this thing's gonna be in my way. Let's see what I can do about that. A little too tight. There we go. Yep, that feels about perfect right there. Try to do this without banging the camera. Crank that down, and then go back in and test it. And that one did tighten up a tiny bit, but it goes in. Actually feels perfect. All right, so that's it. They're all adjusted. And now it's just simply a matter of reversing the disassembly process, covering everything back up. And that's it, you're done. Good. Check for any oil leaks around the
valve cover.